The East India Company's control of India significantly impacted the British economy. Britain was able to export vast quantities of goods such as tea and pepper and sell them for a great profit. This profit helped to fund the Industrial Revolution in Britain. For example, it was used to build textile factories, which employed many people. Imports such as silk and cotton were brought from India and turned into expensive clothes and fabrics before being sold at a higher price back in India. The profits made by the East India Company were invested in Britain. Factory owners in particular earned a lot of money from trade with India. Although factories in Britain provided work, the conditions were often dangerous due to a lack of concern over health and safety. Textile factories particularly employed women and children, who had to work long hours and faced harsh punishments if they worked too slowly. The bloody legacy of the British Empire is not something to be proud of. Through vicious military conquest it used enslavement, massacres, famines, and partitions to create profit. It was the largest empire ever known, covering a quarter of the world and colonizing hundreds of millions of people. The Union flag represents its barbarity. Its first colonies were established in Jamestown, North America in 1607. Upon arrival the British, a significant consequence of this rebellion was that it began the direct rule of the British government over India after a British victory against the sepoys. The East India Company was no longer in control, the British government was. The huge amount of money made from colonizing India, as well as the fact that some of the current crown jewels were taken from India, is one of the reasons some historians say the colony became known as the jewel in the crown. The Powhatans rose up in revenge, but were butchered. Their numbers fell from 8,000 to under 1,000. Britain was responsible for the transportation of 3.5 million African slaves to the Americas, a third of all those transported across the Atlantic. The most profitable West Indian colonies were part of the empire. Some, such as Barbados and Jamaica, had vicious slave codes to deter rebellions. Plantations grew cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane. By 1750, sugar made up a fifth of all European imports. Slave merchants pocketed £12 million on the sale of African people. Between 1761 and 1807, British ports banked £60 million, around £8 billion today, from slave sales. Britain's rulers viewed slaves as subhuman. Slavers killed over 130 slaves on the Zong ship in 1781. Just so they could claim insurance. Life on plantations was brutal. A third of newly imported slaves died within 3 years. The empire forced African economies to depend on Britain for trade. Colonization was brutal, but there was resistance. British took over Kenya in 1890. In 1952, Kenyans demanded independence and waged the Mau Mau Rebellion. The British castrated people, sliced off ears, flogged, executed and burnt those fighting for independence. They herded them into concentration camps that have become known as Britain's Gulag, and killed up to 100,000 people. Britain also wanted to control Egypt and southern Africa to secure trade routes to India. The empire grabbed the Cape Colony in South Africa in 1806 and settlers pushed out the Boers. Its attempts to snatch gold and diamond industries in South Africa led in 1899 to the Second Boer War. At least 25,000 Afrikaners died, mostly in concentration camps set up by the British. The black people who died weren't even counted. Britain invaded Egypt in 1882 and began a long obsession with control of the Middle East. The Suez Canal opened not long after, and soon Britain owned 44% of it. The rush for oil grew after the First World War, when imperial powers vied for control of the oil-rich lands that Britain dominated. Divide and conquer became the empire's unofficial motto. It set ethnic and religious groups against each other. In 1917, the British signed a declaration supporting the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, knowing this would mean the expulsion of Palestinians. India became known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, mostly because of the extent to which it was plundered. The British East India Company started by trading in textiles and spices in 1600. But by the 1750s it was snatching control of ports and cities, and shipping its captured wealth back home. The equivalent of billions of pounds of India's wealth was pocketed by empire. Anger at colonialism fueled the 1857 Indian Mutiny. Thousands of Indian troops stopped serving the British and instead turned their guns on them. In reprisal, the British invented new ways of killing rebels, including blowing them from cannons. After the mutiny, the Crown took direct control and announced that Queen Victoria was now Empress of India. The economic chaos that empire had created led to repeated famines. Millions of people died while the British continued to export food from India.